Good morning.
Good morning. We're certainly glad to see you here on this frigid day.
Thank you. And I feel the same way. In fact, that's how I wanted to start, by saying thank you to everyone who managed to get their car started and their coats on in 4-degree weather. Snow-covered cars. 4 degrees was what my little car said when I tried to start it. When I asked to begin our course in January, it was because I knew I would be here in person for the first 2 Sundays. What I didn't think about was the weather. And of course, the weather has come upon us. But I'm grateful to all of you for being here, grateful to everyone that's joining us by Zoom. My wife, Diane, told me last week quite a few people joined by Zoom, and she saw friends there on the Zoom link. Diane sends her apologies and regrets today. She has a sinus infection. And when we finally went to the doctor to get some attention to it, he heard a rattling in her chest and said, uh-oh, it looks like this might be developing into pneumonia. So they gave her antibiotics and told her to stay at home and stay in bed. And that's where she is this morning. She might join us on the Zoom link if she wakes up and feels good enough. Anyway, thank you all so much for your determination, all your wonderful insights that you shared last week, the perceptive questions that you asked. So I'm very grateful. Last week, we discovered that the terminology and even the categories that we use to understand the actions that Jesus took, our categories are inadequate, right? They are anachronistic. Even our term that appears in the title of my course, the miracles of Jesus, the meaning of those miracles for today. It turns out that the category miracle is not found in the ancient sources. It's a modern category, and the language is just inadequate to the phenomenon. But last week we determined that the material describing the people that Jesus healed and those that he liberated from spirit possession, that tradition is so rich. There are so many stories in the earliest gospel of all, the Gospel of Mark, that even today there is a consensus among historical critical scholars that Jesus did these things. There's no longer a tendency to explain them away, to psychologize them, or to rationalize them. This was an aspect of who Jesus was and of the mission to which he devoted himself. And we have to take it seriously, to discover what it means for us today. And we made a good start last week. I would like to come back there. I sent 2 handouts this time, a repetition of the handout on healing, and then a new handout on exorcisms. So I'd like to come back to a couple of moments on which we just made initial observations last week. I'd like to focus on Mark chapter 1, beginning in verse 35, where Simon Peter attempts to bring Jesus back to his house. And Jesus explains to Simon, "Let us go on to the neighboring towns so that I may proclaim the message."
Verse are we in?
We are in chapter 1, verse 38. He answered, "Let us go on to the neighboring towns so that I may proclaim the message there also, for that is what I came out to do. And the next verse says, and he went throughout all Galilee, proclaiming the message in their synagogues and casting out demons. So one of our discoveries last week is that there is not only a connection, there is a profound affinity. There is an inherent consistency between the actions that Jesus takes, the healings and the exorcisms, and the message that he proclaimed. Now, I'd like to go a little deeper into that point at the beginning of our time this morning. Jesus' message, there is no doubt about what it was. It is the subject of all of the parables and the aphorisms, the unforgettable one-line statements by Jesus, harder than the tooth of time. The parables are introduced in this way. You know it. Now the kingdom of God is like. And the Greek word for kingdom is the word basileia. And the Aramaic word is malkuth. And it doesn't describe a territory. It doesn't designate a form of government. These are nouns that are formed out of verbs. It would be better translated the reign of God, the rule of God. It is by this profound idea that Jesus was encompassed. Gerd Tyson, who wrote a book on the miracle stories, speaks of the eruption of a primal confidence in God. The conviction that God rules. And Jesus saw it everywhere. The falling of the rain, and even the falling of the snow, the rising of the sun. Those were evidently for him revelations of the one who caused the rain to fall and the sun to rise. And can you imagine what it would be like to live in such a consciousness? That the falling of the snow, the rising of the sun. In other words, Jesus was in his own core, in his understanding of the relationship between God and the world. The world was for him full of miracles. It was full of revelations of the reign, the kingdom of God. Now, if that is the case, if that was his message, and if that message expressed his primal confidence in God's reign, then there is a consequence that we can draw for the meaning of his healings and exorcisms. I would argue that Jesus' actions are motivated by the same confidence that is expressed through his message. What does that mean? Evidently, Jesus believed and acted upon the conviction that in a world where God ruled, the terrible constraints upon our full humanity that disease and spirit possession represent, in the world that God ruled, those things would be abolished. Jesus enacted, do you follow this? He was enacting the reign of God when he drove out disease and cast out spirits. It was not God's intention that people suffer from these debilitating constraints upon their full humanity. God created us, what does the book of Genesis say? In God's own image and likeness. That we suffer diseases, that we are haunted and possessed by spirits, is not the will of God. That is not what God intended in creation. It is because of our own fallenness, the sin of Adam and the sin of all the sons and daughters of Adam for more than 5,000 years. But when Jesus pushes back upon these debilitating constraints upon the humanity, the full humanity that God intended, I would argue he is enacting the reign of God. That's quite a conclusion that we have come to already on the basis of the first 2 or 3 paragraphs in the Gospel of Mark. Let us go on to the neighboring towns so that I can proclaim the message there, the message that God rules. And what form does that take in action? It consists of healing of diseases and liberation from spirits.
So, just quickly, so would you say that stands in direct contrast to what the sort of traditional Jewish thinking, Old Testament thinking,
Yes.
say Deuteronomist thinking,
Yes.
that the disasters that befell the Jewish people were in fact the active will of God, right? Is that not what they?
Well, there's no doubt.
Propose?
There's no doubt that is a message of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
That when Israel worships other gods,
Yeah.
When they oppress the poor, when they sin, they are acting contrary to the will of God. And in those cases, the Babylonian captivity, they experience God as wrath. Right?
Yeah, right.
There's an interesting moment here that you've put your finger on, Ray. And actually at the beginning of Romans, Paul says, the orge, the wrath of God, is revealed upon every evil and iniquity of those who bind the truth under a spell through injustice. That's a literal translation of that verse at the beginning of Romans. Paul says that what can be known about God, the truth about God, the God that loves us and created us in God's own image, Paul says, the knowable, togonoston, what can be known about God, is pouring forth, Paul says, from the things that are made. You see that in Jesus' parables, right? The growth of grain in the field, the natural love, natural affection of a father, even for a prodigal son. For Jesus, the natural world was a revelation of the will of God. But when human beings attempt to bind the truth of God under a spell, that's Paul's language, through turning their back on God, through worshiping the creature rather than the creator, then they experience the loving God in the form of wrath. Now for us, that's a hard paradox to understand. In some of Jesus' parables, those who resist the will of God experience divine wrath. But the point of those parables, and the point of his actions, I would argue, is that that is not what God intended. That's a consequence that we experience when we turn our backs upon God. The great theologian Augustine, Luther, of course, was an Augustinian monk. Augustine begins his great book, the Confessions, by saying, "O God, you have made us for whom? Yourself. And our hearts are restless until they find rest in you." And then Augustine goes on to describe his early life, including the sin in which he was involved, and he diagnoses his own condition and the condition of sinful humanity with the Latin expression incurvatus in se. When the human being turns away from God, they do what? They curve back into themselves. Paul says they worship the creature rather than the Creator. In Jesus' message and in his actions, completely engulfed in the confidence that he had in the reign of God. Jesus' healings and exorcisms, I would argue, were an attempt to push back against the effects of human sinfulness by taking action on behalf of the full humanity that God intended in creation. Yes,
I
Larry.
like everything you've said, especially that these need to be seen in terms of fulfilling the reign of God. I looked at a commentary online, and 3 takeaways from that first paragraph were, number 1, he healed on the Sabbath.
Yes.
So we should observe not the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law. That was one. That was not nearly as lofty as what you have had here. The second one was that Peter was married, and that, so it's a bit of a commentary on that.
And has a mother-in-law.
Yeah, and the third thing was that the mother-in-law is healed, not because she needs to be released to be a full person, but she wasn't really regarded as a full person because her purpose of healing her is so that she can serve them. And these were all men that were being served. So that was kind of the takeaway, is that we need to get healed so we can get back to serving.
Oh, that's an interesting conclusion. I would quarrel with that conclusion. I would say that the interpreter there mistakes the result for the purpose.
Yeah,
He thinks that by getting up out of the burning bed where she had a fever, she was fulfilling her purpose.
Yeah.
Actually, that was the result
Yeah, exactly.
of Jesus' action to free her from a condition that God did not intend, but that is the result of our human sinfulness. Well, we're going more deeply into these texts, looking for the meaning and the meaning for us today. And I'd like, in that spirit, to move on to the next story. We briefly touched on it last week. As Jesus is going along the road from one village to another, a man with leprosy, a skin disease, this is chapter 1, verse 40, comes out and kneels down before him and says, "If you are willing, if you wish it, if you will it, you can make me clean." And when Jesus responds to him, having felt a wrenching in his guts, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, "I am willing, be made clean." Now, I think there are 2 points for us here. There are 2 aspects of meaning that we can draw out from this story. First, it requires a resolution, a motion of the will, in order to put ourselves at the disposal of those that are suffering. The natural tendency is to what? Look away, to withdraw, to shield ourselves. Years ago, when the AIDS epidemic was raging, and I was a young professor in Chicago, I was teaching at a Presbyterian church in the suburbs. And on a particular Sunday, when I happened to be there, a member of that church who was dying of AIDS was surrounded by the community at the worship service and afterwards at the coffee hour to express love for him and to say farewell. And so, since I was present at the church for that Sunday, I joined the line of people waiting to say farewell to the man who was dying of AIDS. He was in the final stages of that terrible disease. And in those days, no one really understood fully how AIDS was transmitted, how much physical contact and of what kind was involved. And I have to confess to you that as I came in that line closer and closer to this poor man, I felt reluctance. Would I embrace him or not? Would I take his hand or not? Rabbi Barsky, my friend here in the Dayton area, tells a story that when he was in training to be a rabbi in New York City, walking one cold day like this down Broadway on his way to class, he was approached by a suffering woman clothed in nothing more than a nightshirt, who was moving directly toward him and was saying, "Rabbi, Rabbi," and he confesses that he drew back, pulled his coat around himself, looked the other way, and passed her by. And it was only after he had walked a few steps down the crowded sidewalk that her voice entered into his consciousness, and she heard him say, "Rabbi, will you pray for me?" He says he whirled around, he spun around, and began looking back through the crowd, trying to find the woman who had spoken to him. But she had moved on with the large crowds on Broadway. Now, there is this natural human tendency to keep ourselves safe, to draw back. But the message of this story for us today is that if we're going to do anything to join Jesus in his healing and liberating work, it requires what from us? Resolve, right? A motion of the will. A willingness to put ourselves at others' disposal. Jesus decided to extend himself to a man suffering from leprosy. And he didn't just heal him by speaking a word. It says here that he did what? Stretched out his hand and touched him. Now, this is not an easy lesson for us. The importance of contact, the importance of resolve. And as we identified last week, I think that when the two verbs in this passage, splanchnizomai and embryomai, are correctly translated, they bring before us a picture of Jesus who is emotionally involved in the suffering of others. He feels what? A tugging a wrenching in his guts. Embryomai, he is what? Deeply moved by this man's plight. He feels a boiling up inside himself. And so I would argue we ought not to shield ourselves from the suffering of the world. We ought not to, in a stoic way, turn inward and try to make ourselves invulnerable. Rather, the way of Jesus is full of emotion. It's overflowing with emotion. Now, I'd like to move to the next healing in Mark chapter 3. We didn't have time to look at this one last week. Jesus entered into a synagogue, and he found there a man with a withered hand. And the people there were watching. The preceding paragraph speaks about the scribes and the Pharisees, the religious professionals. They were watching him to see whether he would cure on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him of breaking the Sabbath law. And he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come forward." Then he said to them, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill?" And they were silent. They refused to answer. So he looked around at them with anger. Look at the emotion once again here. He was grieved at their hardness of heart, and he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. And look how the Pharisees responded. Immediately they began to conspire to do what? Put him to death. Now, you probably know that the Greek New Testament that occupies all of my time, the text that is translated in our English Bibles is actually based upon over 2,500 manuscripts. And many of them have a claim to be taken seriously. P46, P45, Codex Vaticanus, Codex Sinaiticus. Well, in Codex Beza Cantabrigiensis, there is an extra verse in this story. And in that extra verse, the man with the withered hand, when he makes his request for healing of Jesus, he says, listen to this, "I was a stonemason and earned my living with my hands." Isn't that interesting? "Jesus, I beseech you to give me back my health so that I no longer have to beg for bread." Isn't that wonderful? That's the Western text, Codex Beza Cantabrigiensis, and a number of other manuscripts. Now, Gerd Tyson, my friend in Heidelberg, whose book I recommended last week, he focuses on that extra verse in the Western text, and he points out that the people who were drawn to Jesus in search of cures and health, many of them were unfortunate people who had a difficult time making a living, the common people, the workers who had no other recourse, but they were drawn toward him. They could see that he felt for them. We are back in a time without hospitals, right? And with very few doctors. The doctors that we know from ancient history and literature, who would that be? Hippocrates and Galen, closer to the New Testament time. They were expensive and they served the wealthy. Galen was the household physician of the emperor, Marcus Aurelius. So, without hospitals and only a few doctors, and the few that existed being very expensive, people who suffered from disease were drawn toward Jesus. And this man with a withered hand says to Jesus, "I made my living. I was a stonemason. Restore my hand so that I no longer have to beg." Gerd Tyson has focused on that social dimension, the common people, the crowd. In the Gospel of Mark, Mark's word repeatedly for those who surrounded Jesus in search of healing and liberation is the word aklos. Not the Greek word demos, right? It's not citizens. It's the multitude. It's the common people, or we might say the mob. Yes.
They didn't have a social net.
No, that's right.
Support net to help people who were incapacitated or disabled.
That's right.
Jesus obviously
In fact,
needed help.
exactly. In fact, if we're looking for the sociological reason why suffering people without resources would be drawn to a holy man, to a rabbi, to a person upon whom the Spirit of God seemed to dwell, it's important to know that instead of hospitals in the first century, in the ancient world, when a person became sick and didn't have the money for a doctor, they would resort to the nearest Asclepiaeum. Who was Asclepius? The healing god of antiquity, pictured with what? A staff and a serpent, right, still the symbol of doctors today. If anyone here has been to Greece, the largest Asclepiaeum in the ancient world is not far from Corinth. It's at a place called Epidaurus. My wife and I visited there a few years ago, and in the museum, there are thousands of plaster, stone, and bronze models of the body parts for which people sought healing when they came to the temple. In fact, slave owners, when a slave became ill, would often take that sick slave to the temple of Asclepius and do what? Dump them there. So that the Emperor Claudius, the emperor during the time of Paul, enacted a law stipulating that if a slave who had been dumped at the temple recovered his or her health, they were henceforth what? Free. Right. So the assumption was that if healing was to be found, it would be in contact with a God, a divine force. People who recognized that the Spirit of God was animating Jesus were drawn to him, like this poor man with a withered hand. Pete.
I'm taken by one thing. No place in here are the headlines. AIDS cured.
Right.
Sickness driven away. It's by personal contact.
Exactly.
The people come forward and say, Jesus, will you help me?
Exactly.
One-on-one. There's no need for that in heaven. So Jesus did not know how to do it. He came down to earth and God said, go to the people, go to the individuals.
Right.
Is that what's going on here?
I think so. Right. There's no massive divine political theology at work here. There's no overarching healthcare plan. But what we see in these stories is the interaction between Jesus and people who are in need, individuals. And we see that also in the very next story. Can we look at that one? The next story, it's actually two stories that have been put together. Jesus has been in a boat, and when he gets to the other side, he is encountered by one of the leaders of the synagogue. The Greek text says literally, the synagogue president comes to Jesus. So this is a person of standing and prestige, a leader in the community. And he tells Jesus, my little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well. And as Jesus is on his way to heal this little girl, who we find out later in the story turns out to be how old? 12 years old. Right. As he is on his way to the house of the synagogue president, he is surrounded by a large crowd. The crowd is pressing upon him. And there was a woman in that crowd who had been suffering from a flow of blood, a hemorrhage. For how long? 12 years. I think the early followers of Jesus who collected these stories and put them together were trying to make a point when they combined a story about a little 12-year-old girl at the point of death and an older woman who has suffered a hemorrhage for 12 years. There was a woman who had suffered for 12 years. And notice it says in verse 26, she had endured much under what? Many physicians. And she had what? Spent all that she had. So she must have had significant resources. And she has exhausted them because the doctors are expensive. She has nowhere else to turn. She was no better. She grew only worse. But she had heard, Pete, here's your point. These stories illustrate encounters between a person who is immersed in the primal confidence in the reign of God and people who are in need. And so she had heard about Jesus, and she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she was saying, and the Greek verb there is an imperfect verb. In Greek, an imperfect verb conveys what? Repeated action. So you get the picture? She, as she approached Jesus from behind, pressing her way through the crowd, she was continually, the author here gives us the ability to hear her inner monologue. Perhaps she was even whispering to herself. She said, "If I but touch his cloak, I will be made well." Now, Pete, take a look at this. This woman is animated not only by her need, right? She is animated by what? Faith. She is animated by a deep trust that Jesus will be able to help her if she can only touch his cloak. Now, Jesus later says to her, after he is healed, he says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well." You see the end of that paragraph? Now, it's important for us to understand that the Greek word that is used here, pistis, it meant something different 2,000 years ago than it does today. In the modern scientific world, after the Enlightenment, after Descartes and the philosophers of subjectivity, pistis, faith, tends among us today to be located as a dimension of subjectivity. Do you believe that something exists? Do you believe it's a mental affirmation, right? That's not what the word meant 2,000 years ago. If you look up pistis in the Greek dictionary of early Christian literature, it actually means trust. It's more simply than mental assent to a proposition. It is a deep form of reliance or trust. Examples make that evident. When a Greek woman was about to give birth, the most vulnerable moment in her life, so many women died in childbirth, there was a little prayer formula that a Greek woman used. We have lots of examples of it on papyri. She said, "I place my life into the pistis of the goddess." She's not saying I believe in the goddess. She's saying what?
Trust.
I trust. I surrender myself completely. Everything that I am, I place into the trust of the goddess. Now, so that's what this woman has. She pushes her way through the crowd because she has trust. Something that she has seen or heard about Jesus leads her to put her whole life, if she can only touch his cloak, I will be made well. And so immediately her flow of blood stopped, and she felt in her body, isn't that interesting, that she was healed of the disease. Immediately, Jesus was aware that power had gone out of him, and he turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched me?" And his disciples said, "Master, you must be crazy. All these people are pressing around you. Can't you see this crowd? How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" And then the Greek is very vivid. Your English text says he looked all around. The Greek is much stronger. He was gazing constantly. Can you pick? The Greek is so vivid. He was looking through each face in the crowd. He was gazing intently to see who had done it. And the woman, knowing what had happened to her, confessed. She came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your pistis," that's the Greek word, "your confidence, your trust, your reliance has made you well." Jesus doesn't claim credit for it. Go in peace, be healed of your disease.
So he doesn't, it was not his will that provoked that healing.
That's a good point. He doesn't even know that she's coming, right? We're not here in the Gospel of Mark. We have a very human Jesus. It's not like Matthew's Jesus, who is omniscient. He doesn't know that she's coming up behind him. In fact, even though he feels that power has gone out from him, he doesn't know who did it, who drew out the power. His eyes are searching the crowd. He might never have identified her, but she did what? Came forward. Because she is the one who is credited by Jesus with the recovery of her health. Your faith has made you well. The story illustrates, I think, or it brings before us the message that the primal confidence in God, in God's reign, that Jesus put into action by healing and exorcism, that primal confidence, Pete, is one that we can share. We can share it. Right? This poor woman shared it. And Jesus says it is that. It's your primal confidence in God that has made you well. Go in peace. Shalom is restored to you. Be healed of your disease. Now you remember this encounter with the woman with the 12-year flow of blood has interrupted the story of the little 12-year-old girl. Jesus is on his way through the street, going to the house of the synagogue president. And because he's been interrupted, he didn't arrive promptly. And so people come from the house of the synagogue leader, and they say to him, devastating report, your daughter is what? She's dead. Why trouble the teacher any longer? Now, I want you to notice how Jesus responds. But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the synagogue president, do not be afraid, only what? Believe. And again, it's the verb form of pistis. Only, and it's the present tense in Greek that Jesus uses here in this verb. Do you know what the present tense denotes? It denotes ongoing, continuous action in the present. So how would you bring that out in the translation? Only go on believing. Go on having trust. The trust that brought you to me in the first place, don't lose it. Don't let it slip away. Don't be afraid. Only keep on trusting. He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And when they came to the synagogue leader's house, he saw a commotion. He saw a tumult. The Greek says thorubos. Thorubos. Can you say that with me? Thorubos. It's tumult is a good translation, but it's almost like a riot. And people were weeping, klaion, and wailing, alalazon. Hear those onomatopoetic verbs that sound like what they are? So members of the household and neighbors, people who care about the synagogue leader and his family, they have concluded that the little girl is what? Dead. And they are overwhelmed with grief. The story gives us no reason to doubt that she is dead. And when he entered, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is what? Not dead, but sleeping." Now, for me, the more interesting point here, the point that allows us to elicit meaning from this story, is not whether the child was dead or, what's the other alternative, had slipped into a coma. For me, the more interesting point related to the meaning of the story is that the picture we are given of Jesus is a person who cannot what? Accept the fact that the girl is what? Dead. They have reported it to him. All around him, there is a tumult of people weeping and wailing, expressing their belief that she has died. Jesus himself cannot accept it. So completely immersed was Jesus in his belief in a world where God ruled. In a world where God ruled a little 12-year-old girl at the beginning of life, this wouldn't happen to her. He can't accept it.
Larry,
The child is not dead, he says. Yes, please, John.
could Jesus be thinking of her sleeping in the sense that she's sleeping in death, waiting for the resurrection? And so he's saying she's just that kind of a sleep.
John, that's an interesting question. In ancient Greek, and it turns out in Aramaic as well, even in English today, sleep is metaphorical language for what? Death, right? Those who have fallen asleep in Jesus, we say, right? We speak of the sleep of death. So, because of that connection in thought and in language, John, your question is a good one. But for me, the most touching thing is the picture it gives us of Jesus, who cannot accept the fact that death will be the end for this girl, whether her life is restored now or eventually in the resurrection. John, your question is a good one. If we think about another story, this one not in the Gospel of Mark, but in the Gospel of John, where someone has died. Who is that? Lazarus. And it is clear that he is dead. Martha says he's been dead more than 3 days. The body is already smelling. The old King James says, he stinketh, Lord. And yet, once again, Jesus cannot accept it. Do you remember before Jesus calls Lazarus forth, he says to Mary and to Martha, he says to them, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, even if he dies, he will what? He will live again. Right. So, John, that story comes closer to your understanding of the relationship between the language of sleep and death. But I think the point is an interesting one that you're making and profound. You may have noticed, of course, that the difference between the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of John is that the theme of Jesus' message and his actions in the Gospel of Mark is the kingdom of God. This primal confidence that God rules. In the Gospel of John, the focus is not the kingdom of God, it is what? The person of Jesus, the one in whom the kingdom of God has become incarnate. And so the issue for John is, what is our relationship to him, to the one who is the resurrection and the life? But in this first gospel, Mark, we're presented with a very human Jesus. He cannot accept the fact that the little girl is dead. He can't accept the fact that that's what God intended. And the people think he's a fool, right? They think he's denying reality. Look what the text says. When he tells them that the child is not dead, they laughed at him. The Greek verb there is stronger than laughter. It's a mocking laugh. They derided him. Then he put them all outside. He took the little girl's father and mother and the 3 disciples that were with him, and notice again the touch, taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha cum, which of course is not Greek, it's Aramaic, and so Mark has to translate it for his readers, which means, little girl, get up. And immediately the girl stood up and began to walk about, for she was 12 years of age.
Could it be that he's rejecting those people from the kingdom of God by putting them out?
Now, that's really interesting, isn't it? He refuses. This is something we will come back to in the final week of our course. Pete, you're ahead of us again. But in the final week, we're going to put all this together and ask, who is Jesus, right? As a result of all of these stories. And one thing that we can already begin to see is that Jesus never takes his actions. He never performs a healing or an exorcism simply for what?
Publicity.
Publicity, exactly. Never takes payment. Never advertises or uses it to enhance his own reputation. In the last week, when we work together, I'll bring material into class where the privacy of Jesus in performing his miracles contrast with the publicity that was sought by other powerful divine men in the ancient world. So Pete, you're onto something. They were overcome with amazement, and he ordered them that no one should know this. And he told them to give her something to eat. Isn't that a beautiful and amazing story? Larry.
Larry, I wonder if I might just give an example from one of us. Person who often was in your classes is George Schmidt.
Yes.
George Schmidt has been in and out of the hospital, and he went to rehab. It lasted 10 hours, came back again, couldn't breathe, basically went into almost a coma state.
Mm.
So the hospital, Miami Valley, said, we're going to give him up to hospice.
Uh-huh.
So he was taken to hospice at on Wilmington.
This past week.
Yeah, unresponsive. His wife hadn't seen him for a month. He's not too well. Jim got Anne, took him to the hospital, took her to the hospital. They are expecting that he's on his way out, practically dead. And he's sitting up and having a conversation with them. George's brother called me that same day and said, he's a scientist. And he said, I have no idea how to explain this. And the doctor the same way said, he used the word miracle. We don't know how long it's going to last. But does anybody know whether he's slipped back? But it appears as though everybody's estimate was totally wrong. And so he may walk out of the tomb, so to speak, thinking that he'll probably go home.
That's really wonderful.
But for me, as a pastor, the problem for an illustration like that is, can you argue from the specific to the more general.
Right.
That when people can't believe that someone has died, as in the case of, or people believe they've died and they haven't. I can't go to somebody else who's in a similar situation and say, don't worry about this, only sleeping.
Mhm.
Well, I'm not Jesus, for one thing,
Right.
none of us are, but, it's hard then to know how do you, and what I'm searching for is what is the takeaway, what is the meaning?
Right.
from,
Right.
we know that, there's something beyond what we might just say, the ordinary course of events, or the science of it. There's this realm you're talking about.
I think one of the takeaways for me from this story, it challenges us to answer, have we given up on certain
Yeah.
people? Have we given up on certain diseases? Or are we willing to commit ourselves in individual cases, but also in terms of our social and ecclesiastical policy? My own mother was dying. You may recall, in 2012, I was teaching here at Epiphany. You remember that? When she came near to the end, my sister called me and said, she is dying, you should come to Arkansas. I got on an airplane and flew down there. She was in a coma. She had already slipped into a coma, and I was unable to talk to her. And Larry, I had given up, right? I had given up on being able to speak to her. And my sister came into the room late on a Sunday afternoon, and I was just sitting there doing my homework beside her bed. I was preparing for the next lecture. And my sister said to me, Larry, you should read our mother's favorite scriptures. And I knew what those were. And so I opened the Bible and began to read. Can you guess what happened? She woke up. She woke up. Now, she wasn't awake for long, right? But she woke up and was able to communicate with us, with my sisters and I. I told her that we loved her, and she was able to speak her last words to us. She said, she looked at us and she said, I love you. And her head dropped and she was gone. But my sister was right. I never would have heard those words, right? Think what a blessing those words have been to me. And perhaps she needed to say it. But I had given up. And my sister challenged me. She said, go and read her favorite scriptures to her. Don't give up. And she awakened. So I think that's one of the things we take away from this, is that we ask ourselves, have we given up individually, personally, but also as a church, as a society? Have we given up on helping certain people, on dealing with certain problems? And the meaning, I think, of these stories for us is that Jesus did not give up, even when he was told that the little girl was what? Dead. And even when everything indicated that she was dead. This is not the only story like this from the ancient world. Last week, I mentioned a holy man named Apollonius of Tuana. You remember that? In his life, as related by the philosopher Philostratus, one day Apollonius was passing through a town, and he encountered a funeral procession on its way to the graveyard. A young woman who was engaged to be married had died in the bloom of life. And Apollonius approached the funeral procession and told them to stop. And he said, if you give me a moment, I will put an end to your grief. And according to Philostratus, he approached the bier, leaned over and whispered to the girl, and she woke up. Now, Philostratus, the philosopher who tells us this story, he said there was a debate afterwards between the people who witnessed this event, whether the little girl was what? Really dead, or only sleeping. So there are some similarities between these two stories. And Philostratus says, perhaps Apollonius saw some sign that her skin was not completely pallid, that there was a little motion in her chest, a little bit of life left. And that was what led him to call for the funeral procession to halt. So the philosopher Apollonius tries to determine how this happened, whether she was really dead or not. None of that appears in the Gospel of Mark, right? Mark gives us no reason to believe that the little girl was anything other than dead. And the takeaway for us is that Jesus has not given up, right? He has not given up. The little girl who woke up here, we don't know anything more about her. We don't hear about her again in the Gospels. Did she live to a ripe old age? Did she bear children? Did she pass on the very next year or the next week? We don't know. But Larry, I think like you, I'm looking for the meaning of these stories for today. And for me, the story is about a picture of Jesus who is so completely immersed in the love and the will of God that he cannot accept that this was the end for which this girl's life was intended. Other questions, comments? Let me check my time. Oh, no. Oh, no. All right. I'm sorry that I didn't get to talk about the exorcisms for today. I would like to talk about those stories next week. They are very important. If you would like to do a little background reading, I've put up here on the board Giovanni Bazzana, professor of New Testament at Harvard Divinity School, a good friend of mine. I published this book in the book series that I edit for Yale University Press back in 2020. The book is called Having the Spirit of Christ. Look at the subtitle, Spirit Possession and Exorcism in Early Christ Groups. It is the best book ever written on the subject. He takes seriously the phenomenon of spirit possession. He doesn't try to explain it away. I was telling John before class began, Giovanni Bazzana comes from that poor region of Italy. In the boot, Italy is shaped like a boot, and Giovanni Bazzana comes from the heel of the boot, an impoverished area where even the Catholic Christians resemble Pentecostals, right? There is a strong belief among them in spirit possession and in the practice of exorcism. So he knew something about this from his childhood, and he devoted, this is now his third book, to the subject of spirit possession and exorcism in the early church. You may want to look at that in preparation for next week, and we will come right back and start here. Thank you all so much for all your insights today. Good questions, good comments. I won't be here in person next week, I'm sorry to say. I'll be joining you by Zoom from the Bronx in New York.
Going with you?
No.